My name is Captain Fosu. I am 34 years old. I have been a logistics intelligence officer for 10 years. And on a Thursday morning in September, I stepped off a transport aircraft after 6 months deployed and was met at the gate by an officer I did not know who told me my security clearance had been suspended, not downgraded. Suspended. Effective 3 weeks ago. I had been in a forward operating base 3,000 miles away 3 weeks ago. I had been doing my job. Filing my reports, managing my team. I said, on what grounds? He said, a report filed under your credentials. An incident report, filed 6 weeks ago. I said, I did not file any incident report 6 weeks ago. I was deployed. He said, the report was filed from a terminal at this base. I stood on the tarmac with my kit bag at my feet and the September sun behind me, and I understood 3 things simultaneously. Someone had used my credentials to file a report at a base I was not at. The report had described an incident I knew nothing about. And whatever that incident was, it had been serious enough to suspend my clearance before I even landed. I said, I need to see the report. He said, that is above my authority. You will need to report to the security office. I picked up my kit bag. I went to the security office. I did not go home first. Let me tell you about the deployment first. 6 months in a forward operating base, supporting a logistics intelligence operation. My job was to track supply chain movements and identify irregularities that might indicate compromise or misrouting of critical assets. Patient work, detailed work, the kind that does not produce dramatic results, but prevents larger problems from developing unseen. I had been good at it for 10 years. My team of 4 had worked well. We had filed regular reports through secure channels. We had flagged 3 irregularities during the 6 months. All 3 had been assessed and addressed through the chain. Nothing in those 6 months had involved me filing an incident report from a base I was not present at. Nothing in those 6 months had given anyone grounds to suspend my clearance. Or so I had believed. The security office. A major named David Larty met me there. He was the officer responsible for administering the suspension. He was courteous. He was also, I noticed, careful. He told me what he could tell me. 6 weeks ago, a report had been filed from a terminal at this base, filed under my name and credentials. The report described an incident involving the mishandling of classified logistics data during a domestic base exercise. The incident described had been assessed as a serious breach. My clearance had been suspended pending investigation. I said, I was deployed 6 weeks ago. I was at the forward operating base. There are 6 months of records confirming my presence and activity there. He said, I understand. The investigation will consider all of that. I said, who else has seen the report? He said, it went through standard channels. Several people at multiple levels. I said, and the terminal it was filed from. Is there access log data? He said, that is part of the investigation. He said it carefully, in the way of someone who knows more than he is currently able to share. I said, Major Larty, what was in the report? Not the incident, the report itself. How was it written? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, it was filed correctly, formatted correctly. The language was consistent with your previous reports. I sat with that. Someone had filed a report using my credentials from a terminal at this base, while I was 3,000 miles away. And the report had been written in language consistent with my previous reports. They had studied how I write. The object at the center of everything was the report itself. I did not have full access to it yet. It had been sealed as part of the investigation, but I knew it existed. I knew it bore my name. I knew it had been written to sound like me. And I knew that somewhere in it there was a description of an incident I had never witnessed. An incident serious enough to suspend a 10-year clearance 3 weeks before the officer named in the report even landed back on home soil. The question was not whether someone had framed me. That was clear. The question was why. What incident needed a report filed under a credible name? What was serious enough to require that level of cover? I called Colonel Beatrice Tando from a payphone outside the security building. Not a baseline, not my phone, a payphone. Because if someone had used my credentials to file a report, they may have had access to more than my credentials, and I was not going to hand them my phone call. Tando was the senior intelligence oversight officer for this region. I had worked under her 4 years ago. I trusted her judgment and her discretion. She answered on the third ring. I gave her 4 sentences. Return from deployment this morning. Clearance suspended. Report filed under my credentials 6 weeks ago from a base I was not at. Written in my style. She said nothing for 8 seconds. Then she said, "Where are you right now?" I said, "Payphone. Outside security." She said, "Good instinct. Stay off your personal devices. I will have someone with you within 2 hours. Do not speak to anyone else about this until then." She said, "Amira, the report. What incident did it describe?" I said, "I have not been given full access yet. Mishandling of classified logistics data during a domestic base exercise." She said, "When was the exercise?" I said, 6 weeks ago, while I was deployed. She said, "I know about that exercise. I need to look at something." 2 hours. She ended the call. I stood at the payphone for a moment. She had known about the exercise, and something in the way she said, "I need to look at something," told me she had connected a thread I had not yet seen. I want to pause here, because standing outside a security building on a Thursday morning, having just stepped off 6 months of deployment, and understanding that someone had used my name and my writing style to cover something while I was away, is the moment this story became something much larger than a clearance suspension. If you have ever come home to find that someone had used your absence to build something against you, drop a comment below and subscribe right now. Because what Colonel Tando found when she looked at that exercise and what the report was actually covering is the part that changes everything. Tando's investigator arrived in 94 minutes. Her name was Dr. Clara Nkrumah. Civilian, IG office. She carried a forensic analysis kit and the focused economy of someone who has learned that questions matter more than statements. She reviewed the suspended clearance file. She reviewed the report that had triggered it. She reviewed the terminal access logs from 6 weeks ago. She worked for 41 minutes without speaking. Then she told me 3 things. The terminal used to file the report had been accessed with a valid credential at 21:34 on a Wednesday evening 6 weeks ago. The credential was mine. The access had lasted 19 minutes. She explained how the credential had worked. During deployment, my home-based terminal access had not been administratively deprovisioned, a gap in standard procedure that should have been closed when I shipped out. Someone with knowledge of that gap, someone with administrative oversight of credential management, had exploited it. They had authenticated as me from a home-based terminal because my home-base access was never switched off. The base exercise described in the report had taken place that same Wednesday. It had involved the movement of a classified logistics asset between 2 storage facilities on the base. The exercise had not been publicly scheduled. It had appeared on internal planning documents only. She said the report describes the mishandling of that asset, a breach of handling protocol that could, if accurately described, result in significant accountability questions for the officers who managed the exercise. She said, "But the breach described did not happen. We have reviewed the exercise documentation, and the breach your report describes is not in any record." I said, "The report was filed to create a record of a breach that did not occur." She said, "That is our assessment, and it was filed under your name because your name gave it credibility. 10 years of clean analytical work, no prior incidents, a record consistent enough that a report under your credentials would be taken seriously without immediate question." She said, "This was never meant to be a frame that survived close scrutiny. It was a delay tactic. File a credible-looking report 3 weeks before you land. Long enough for the exercise review to be classified as a handling breach and redirected away from the exercise itself. By the time you returned and contradicted it, the review would already be pointed in the wrong direction." She said, "Your deployment records would have cleared you, eventually." But eventually was the point. They needed weeks, not permanence. I said, "What was actually happening during that exercise?" She said, "That is what Colonel Tando is working on right now." Tando called at 19:23. She had spent the day working through the exercise documentation, the planning records, the movement logs for the classified asset. The asset had moved correctly during the exercise. No breach had occurred, but the movement logs showed something the planning documents did not account for. The asset had been moved through a facility not on the planned route, a brief deviation, approximately 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, there was a gap in the observation record. Someone had used those 11 minutes for something they did not want documented. And when they realized the gap might be noticed, they needed a cover, a report that explained the gap as a handling breach, a human error that would account for the anomaly without revealing what had actually happened during those 11 minutes. My name had given that cover credibility. My absence had given them the window to file it before I could contradict it, and the deprovisioning gap in my credentials had given them the access. 3 vulnerabilities, all exploited at once. Tando said, "The asset involved is connected to a procurement chain I have been monitoring for 4 months. Your report gave me the link I was missing. The investigation ran for 5 months. The 11 minutes in the facility contained the answer. 2 officers had used the gap in the observation record to access the classified asset and copy data from it. Data connected to a procurement chain that had been under quiet scrutiny for over a year. The data they copied had been passed to a civilian contractor outside the chain of authorization. The false incident report had been their attempt to explain the observation gap before anyone examined it. If the gap was attributed to a handling breach, the asset movement would be reviewed for protocol failures rather than for what had actually occurred. It had nearly worked. It had not worked because I came home. Because I went to the security office before I went home. Because I used a payphone. Because Tando connected a thread she had been watching for 4 months to a report filed under my name. The 2 officers were arrested in month 2. Both were charged with unauthorized access to classified assets, passing classified data to an unauthorized recipient, and filing a false official report. Both pleaded guilty. One is serving 6 years, the other is serving 8 years. My clearance was reinstated in month 3. Full clearance, no conditions, no annotations. The false report was removed from the record and replaced with a formal notation documenting the fraud. My name is clean, Major David Larde. He had administered the suspension correctly and professionally. He had known more than he could share when I asked about the access logs. He had been part of the preliminary investigation from the beginning. He found me in the corridor 2 weeks after my clearance was reinstated. He told me that the moment I asked about the writing style of the report, he had understood I was going to be all right. I asked what he meant. He said, "Most officers in your position come in and argue about the incident, about why they could not have been involved. You asked about the report itself, about how it was written. That told me you were already thinking about the mechanism rather than the accusation." He said, "Officers who think about the mechanism are usually the ones who find the answer." I said, "It took 5 months and a colonel and a forensic investigator." He said, "It always takes more than one person, but someone has to ask the first right question." I thought about that for a long time afterward. The first right question had been about the writing, not the incident, the report itself. The false report is in the evidence archive now, filed under my name, written in my style, describing an incident that never happened, and beside it in the same archive folder is the notation that replaced it, a formal record of what was done with my name and why and what followed. Both documents together tell a more complete story than either one alone. That is usually how it works. Here is what a suspended clearance and a report I never wrote taught me. When something is wrong, go to the mechanism, not the accusation, not the incident, the document itself, the terminal that filed it, the window of time, the writing. Because a false thing is always built from somewhere. It has an origin. It has a method. It has a moment where a real person made a real decision to construct it. Find that moment. That is where the answer lives. I had been home for 3 hours when I called Tando from a payphone. I had been back for 5 months when the 2 officers were arrested. The distance between those 2 moments was built from one decision, to ask about the writing rather than the accusation, to go to the mechanism, and to use a payphone. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And subscribe. I am here every week with a new story. She came home. She asked the right question. Everything followed from that.